What if the earliest words humanity ever pressed into the world were not the birth cry of civilization, but its final confession? Imagine the oldest texts we possess not as a beginning, but as a desperate attempt to keep something from being forgotten. In the scorching plains of southern Iraq, where wind sweeps across abandoned foundations and burial mounds, lie the remains of cities older than myth. Their walls are broken, their towers toppled, yet beneath layers of hardened earth rest thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, silent, patient, waiting for someone to understand them. On these small, sun-hardened slabs are strange scratches arranged in patterns that look like the footprints of a bird, tiny wedges pressed into wet clay with such intent that they still speak after 5,000 years. We now call this script cuneiform. It is the oldest continuous record of human thought ever discovered, and its presence raises a question that no one expected. How can the first attempt at writing be so complete? These tablets do not behave like the tentative first steps of a culture learning to communicate. They do not stutter or hesitate. They speak confidently, as though the scribes who carved them were not inventing language but preserving knowledge before it vanished forever. If this was truly humanity's first script, why does it read like the work of a people who already knew everything they needed to say? Before we follow that riddle into the desert, imagine yourself listening in a darkened room, perhaps close to sleep. If these stories soothe you rather than frighten you, allow the uncertainty to settle around you like night air. You and I stand on the edge of a mystery that stretches backward far further than history is willing to admit. The rediscovery of ancient Sumer did not happen with the grand revelation one might expect from such a monumental civilization. It began with dust-covered scholars digging beneath ruins and brick mounds in the late 19th century. When European excavators pried open the earth near the ancient city of Uruk, they were prepared to find fragments of broken temples or remnants of crude settlements. Instead, they uncovered entire storerooms meticulously filled with clay tablets, organized, protected, archived with a sense of urgency that suggests their creators knew that time was running out. Each tablet, barely larger than a modern paperback, was covered in intricate symbols, pressed into its surface with a precision that defied assumption. When researchers eventually deciphered the script, they were stunned. They had not uncovered rudimentary pictographs or childlike attempts at communication. They were reading tax regulations, legal disputes, mathematical calculations, astronomical observations, religious hymns, medical treatments, royal decrees, and myths of creation. In other words, the Sumerians did not appear as a primitive people stumbling towards civilization. They emerged already literate, already organized, already established. Their cities rose from the earth as though they had always been there, complete with temples, canals, administrative buildings, and residential districts. Their writing system, one of the most complex ever created, appeared practically overnight, with hundreds of symbols already in use from the very beginning. This abruptness unsettled historians. Normally, civilizations evolve slowly. Nomadic groups settle. Villages become towns. Tools advance from stone to bronze. Writing systems begin with crude pictures, gradually growing more symbolic as need and abstraction expand. But Sumer ignores this pattern entirely. Around 3500 BCE, it steps into the historical record fully articulated, possessing architecture, governance, trade networks, mathematics, and religious systems that should have taken centuries, if not millennia, to develop. This raises an uncomfortable question. How does a culture materialize without a developmental trail? Scholars proposed various explanations. Some argued that earlier evidence simply had not been discovered yet, eroded away by time or lying buried beneath the river sediments. Others imagined precursor societies now lost to history, whose achievements seeded Sumer's sudden rise. These attempts at explanation grew increasingly strained as more tablets were translated and more ruins uncovered. Then the Sumerians themselves offered their own explanation, one embedded not in theory, but in their own records. Repeated throughout their inscriptions appears a chilling assertion. They did not invent civilization, they restored it. One oft-cited phrase claims that kingship did not originate among humans at all, but was lowered from heaven to the first city, Eridu. This single idea, woven through their texts, implies a world that existed before theirs, one destroyed so thoroughly that only fragments of its memory remained. It is here that the Sumerians diverge from every other ancient culture. Most peoples claim divine favour or noble beginnings. The Sumerians claim inheritance, an inheritance from a vanished age. Their scribes saw themselves as caretakers of something older than their own society, guardians of knowledge they did not create but were compelled to preserve. Imagine being the person who shaped such a tablet. You would sit cross-legged on a reed mat, a damp piece of clay before you. In your hand, a stylus of cut reed. With each careful impression, you pressed a thought into permanence. Sometimes those ancient scribes left fingerprints on the clay, whorls and ridges hardened by fire or sun. Today those fingerprints remain. Through them, we meet people long dead, whose hands moved in steady rhythm, recording knowledge as though they feared it would be lost forever. What did they know that we have forgotten? Among the tablets are records tracking the movements of Venus, with a precision modern astronomers did not achieve until telescopes appeared more than 4,000 years later. There are mathematical tables that reveal an understanding of compound interest. There are medical texts prescribing herbs, oils, and surgical procedures that still hold relevance. There are myths describing attempts to create humans using clay and divine essence, stories that recount trial, error and refinement, rather than effortless manifestation. And running through these myths is a haunting motif, a time before, a lost age, a world shattered by catastrophe. This brings us to the flood. One might assume a flood myth is merely symbolic, yet beneath several Sumerian cities lies a thick layer of sterile clay, evidence of a single, devastating flood event. Archaeologist Leonard Woolley was among the first to dig deep enough to find it. While searching for the earliest inhabitants of the city of Ur, he struck a layer devoid of artifacts, a barren sheet of silt several meters thick. Beneath that layer, he discovered remnants of an older culture. Something catastrophic had drowned an entire world and buried it under mud. The Sumerians did not describe this as legend, they recorded it as history. Their king lists divide time into two eras, before the flood and after the flood. Everything before it is presented as a world completely unlike the one that followed. Everything after it is reconstruction, civilization rebooted. Suddenly, the Sumerian insistence on restoration makes chilling sense. If they had inherited fragments of a world destroyed by floodwaters, their frantic desire to catalogue knowledge becomes understandable. They were survivors, not beginners. When the modern world considers itself the pinnacle of history, it imagines itself at the start of an upward journey. But the Sumerians may have viewed themselves at the end of one, standing among ruins, documenting what remained before memory dissolved completely. As you picture those ancient tablets resting in silent museum halls, imagine them not as proclamations of a new dawn, but as messages from the twilight of an older world. The Sumerians were not announcing the beginning of humanity. They were protecting the last echoes of a civilization drowned by time. They seemed to whisper, across thousands of years, this is not where the story begins. This is what survived. If Sumer was not the first chapter of civilization but the salvage of something older, then the next logical question is this. What exactly made the Sumerians so exceptional? How did they produce cities, administration, writing, and science with a level of maturity that should have required thousands of years to accumulate? To understand the full magnitude of this anomaly, we must examine what a civilization normally looks like when it forms, and then compare it to what Sumer inexplicably became from the moment it appeared. Across the ancient world, every major culture follows a recognizable developmental arc. The process is slow, almost painfully so. Humans settle near rivers, cultivate crops, and gradually abandon nomadic life. Simple villages grow into towns which expand into city-states. Architecture begins with small shrines, storage huts, and communal gathering spaces. Over centuries, tools evolve from stone to copper to bronze. Writing systems originate as crude pictographs, literal drawings of objects, before slowly evolving into abstract symbols. The process is incremental, layered, and full of failed experiments, but in Sumer, none of these steps appear. There are no transitional phases, there is no apprenticeship of civilization. One moment the region is dotted with humble agricultural communities, the next Immense cities rise from the earth with temples aligned to the heavens, irrigation systems humming with mathematical precision, and a writing script so refined it seems impossible that it was anyone's first attempt. The earliest levels of Uruk, often regarded as one of the first true urban centres in human history, do not present the messy architecture of a society learning to build. Instead, the city sprawls across hundreds of hectares, boasting defensive walls that encircle a population of tens of thousands. To erect such fortifications, countless workers must have quarried clay, moulded it into bricks, dried them in the sun, and transported them over vast distances. They needed to calculate dimensions, maintain standard measurements, coordinate labour, manage food supplies, and plan far into the future. Nothing about this suggests experimentation. It suggests knowledge of what a city must be long before the first cornerstone was placed. Inside those walls, the city is carefully arranged. Residential quarters cluster together in logical patterns. Sacred precincts are elevated on massive platforms. Industrial zones exist where pottery is produced, metals are worked, and goods are stored. The great temple dedicated to the sky god rises above the city, not as a primitive shrine, but as a monumental structure built with such expertise that later cultures would replicate its design for centuries. There is no indication that Sumerians struggled toward these accomplishments. They behaved not like inventors, but like people rebuilding something they already understood. If we travel south to the site of Eridu, traditionally considered the oldest Sumerian settlement, the pattern becomes even more pronounced. Archaeologists expected to find simple, rudimentary shrines at the earliest levels, crude buildings reflecting the first attempt at organized worship. Instead, the structures display a surprising degree of architectural sophistication. Rooms are laid out with purpose, altars are positioned with symmetry. Orientation appears deliberate, as though the builders already knew how temples were meant to function. What is even more perplexing is that by the time Eridu enters what we consider its true Sumerian phase, its temples are not merely functional, they're monumental, designed with blueprints that ripple through all later Sumerian architecture. One of these early temples would become the prototype for the ziggurat, the massive stepped pyramids that would come to dominate Sumerian skylines. How does a civilization produce its architectural masterpiece at the beginning of its existence? The same anomaly emerges in Lagash, a powerful Sumerian city-state whose fortunes waxed and waned across centuries. The earliest excavations reveal advanced irrigation systems engineered with such accuracy that water flowed evenly across fields, supporting dense populations. Managing water in Mesopotamia is no simple feat. The land lies between two unpredictable rivers, prone to seasonal flooding and sudden drought. Improper canal design can salt the earth, destroy crops, or starve entire regions. Yet the Sumerians mastered the process immediately, producing waterways that required a level of engineering knowledge no other early civilization possessed at such an early stage. The Egyptians, by comparison, spent centuries refining their irrigation. Their earliest attempts failed repeatedly as canals silted up or drained improperly. Their settlements grew slowly across several phases, each expanding on the last. They learned through trial and error. The Sumerians seem to have skipped the trials entirely. Writing presents an even deeper mystery. The moment cuneiform appears, it is already capable of expressing abstract legal ideas, poetic imagery, astronomical data, religious doctrines, and daily records of trade and labour. The earliest tablets exhibit hundreds of symbols, combining phonetic and logographic elements, a feat that should have required centuries of evolution. Where are the crude prototypes? Where are the half-formed alphabets or abandoned symbol systems that show writing learning to walk? They do not exist. Instead, the first evidence of writing appears in full stride, as though the Sumerians had inherited an intellectual toolkit rather than forged it themselves. If someone taught them how to write, that teacher has vanished without a trace. If they invented it independently, they did so without leaving behind a single misstep. This pattern repeats across every domain of their civilization. Their legal codes emerge fully articulated, complete with rules for property ownership, debt repayment, inheritance rights, compensation for injury, and penalties for negligence. There is no developmental curve, no primitive eye-for-an-eye justice evolving into nuanced law. Instead, complexity arrives immediately, as if the Sumerians were codifying long-standing principles rather than inventing them. Their metallurgy reveals the same phenomenon. Bronze, an alloy requiring precise ratios and temperatures, appears without a rudimentary phase. The Sumerians did not spend centuries producing brittle swords or flawed tools. They began with a working recipe and mastered it from the outset. Their artisans shaped ceremonial objects, agricultural tools, and weapons with equal skill, leaving no evidence of a learning curve. Nowhere is this more striking than in their mathematics and astronomy. The Sumerians based their entire numerical system not on 10, as we do today, but on 60. This might seem arbitrary, until one realizes that 60 is the most versatile number within the first 100 integers, divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. Its elegance supports geometry, astronomy, and timekeeping in ways base 10 systems cannot match. Even now, we count minutes in 60-second increments and divide circles into 360 degrees, echoes of a Sumerian system so efficient that the world never abandoned it. Yet no Sumerian text claims to have invented mathematics. Their instructional tablets speak of knowledge originating in distant days, a phrase implying inheritance rather than innovation. Their multiplication tables extend into realms of calculation other ancient cultures would not reach for thousands of years. Their scribal schools did not teach experimental arithmetic. They taught established rules. Their astronomical records are even more confounding. The Sumerians track the motion of Venus with such precision that modern astronomers were bewildered when comparing the ancient tables against current measurements. The Sumerian observations are accurate to a single day over cycles lasting decades. To compile such data, one must track the heavens over generations, passing precise records from one observer to the next. For this to be possible, the Sumerians must have inherited a tradition of astronomical observation older than their own culture. So we are left with a puzzle. Why does Sumer resemble not a newborn civilization, but one that woke up remembering? That question is not metaphorical. Throughout their inscriptions, the Sumerians portray themselves as heirs of something older. Their religious texts speak of cities founded long before the present age. Their myths describe a world where rulers lived extraordinary lifespans, knowledge flowed freely, and beings from beyond the mortal world instructed humanity in the arts of measurement, agriculture, and construction. Their vocabulary is full of restoration, not invention. Phrases like, "what was lost is made again," or "as it was before." It is as though they believed themselves to be rebuilding a shattered mirror, piecing together reflections of a world that once was whole. If this were the claim of a single myth, one might dismiss it. But when every artifact, every temple inscription, every legal text, and every myth fragment echoes the same conviction, it becomes difficult to ignore. Civilizations invent themselves. Sumer rebuilt itself. Something, somewhere, had come before them. This leaves us with only two possibilities. Either humanity achieved an advanced level of civilization far earlier than we currently acknowledge and then lost it, or the Sumerians encountered someone or something that handed them knowledge from beyond their own cultural memory. Whichever truth lies buried beneath the dust of time, the Sumerians did not emerge from nowhere. They arrived remembering. And that, perhaps more than any ruin or relic, is the greatest mystery they left behind. Among all the relics Sumer left behind, none provokes more unease than a small clay prism inscribed with columns of writing so dense and orderly that it seems almost bureaucratic at first glance. Yet within this artifact lies a story that challenges every assumption about the origins of civilization. It appears unremarkable on the surface, no larger than a container one might idly hold while reading, and yet what is written upon it threatens to overturn the accepted timeline of human history. This object is known as the King List, and it should have been nothing more than a simple administrative document. Instead, it reads like a transmission from another world. The text begins not with a modest account of local rulers or the founding of a city, but with a statement that feels like a thunderbolt striking the quiet plane of historical certainty. According to the ancient scribes, rulership itself did not emerge gradually among humans, nor was it seized through force or inherited from tribal leaders. Instead, it descended from somewhere beyond the mortal realm. The The phrase is so straightforward that it resists metaphorical interpretation. Kingship arrived from the heavens and took root in the first city. With those words, history does not start. It interrupts something already in motion. The list continues by naming rulers whose reigns stretch across spans of time that our minds are not prepared to accept. These are not the inflated lifespans of legends meant to inspire awe. They are numerically precise durations so vast that they seem to belong to geological epochs rather than human history. One ruler reigns for nearly 30,000 years. Another holds power for more than 36,000. A third rules for over 43,000. The text does not embellish, justify, or contextualize these figures. They are presented as casually as one might note the length of a modern administration. City after city is listed, each with rulers whose reigns stretch into the tens of thousands of years, and the tone of the text remains clinical, detached, devoid of mythic flourish. It reads not like a story, but like a record. Then, without warning or transition, the narrative fractures. A single line marks a boundary between the conceivable and the incomprehensible. A great flood sweeps over the land. Everything before that moment belongs to a realm of impossible durations, cosmic scales of time measured not in generations but in epochs. Everything after it belongs to the world we recognize. Suddenly, kings reign for decades, perhaps a century at most. Lifespans shrink. The temporal order collapses into something mortal and limited. It is as though the flood did not merely wash away cities and people, but time itself. In that instant, history transforms from something vast and incomprehensible into something familiar. The king list does not treat this shift as symbolic. It treats it as a fact. There is no poetry around it, no explanation of divine punishment or moral decline, merely a stark division, a before and an after separated by water. Once the flood recedes, kingship is said to descend from the heavens once more, but this time in a new city, as if authority itself had to be rebooted. The implication is unmistakable. Civilization did not begin with Sumer. It began again with Sumer. The king list presents the first age as something that ended so completely that only fragments remained, fragments which the post-flood world struggled to reassemble. To the modern reader, the simplest reaction is disbelief. Surely these reigns are allegories, exaggerations meant to elevate ancestral figures to divine status. Yet that explanation grows thin the deeper one looks. The king list does not separate myth from history. It uses the same tone, the same structure, the same method of documentation to record both impossible reigns and rulers whose existence is independently verified by archaeology. Later names on the list correspond to monarchs whose inscriptions, burials, and cities have been found. The text is not a patchwork of fantasy and fact. It is a continuum, which forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility. If the later sections are reliable, what gives us the right to dismiss the earlier ones out of hand? The real dilemma arises when the numbers before the flood display a mathematical coherence that is anything but random. The reign lengths align with cycles embedded in the Sumerian numerical system, which is based on the number 60. These massive durations can be divided into units associated with astronomical phenomena, planetary cycles, and celestial movements so complex that they suggest not myth, but calculation. It is as though the early rulers represent not merely individuals, but eras, periods during which knowledge, culture, and astronomy were maintained by a civilization with an understanding of time so deep that it could track cosmic rhythms spanning millennia. If this is true, then the king list is not a roster of kings, but a chronicle of epochs, an encoded history of the world long before the flood erased its memory. But even this interpretation leaves questions hanging in the air like dust motes suspended in museum light. If the flood marked the end of an age, what exactly was destroyed? And how could the survivors retain enough knowledge to rebuild cities of extraordinary complexity immediately afterward? Archaeologists excavating ancient Mesopotamian cities repeatedly encountered a peculiar layer of clay, lifeless, artifact-free, several meters thick. Beneath it, evidence of older human activity. Above it, the unmistakable signature of early Sumer. Nothing about this suggests a slow evolution. Something existed. It was submerged, and afterward, something new emerged, carrying echoes of what lay below the mud. When the king list states that kingship returned once the waters receded, it implies a deliberate re-establishment of order, as if someone, or something, had ensured that memory was not entirely lost. The flood did not erase the concept of kingship, it delayed it. The idea waited, dormant, until it could be reintroduced. And whoever reintroduced it did so with such confidence that entire cities rose in alignment with cosmic patterns, as though the builders already knew where the stars demanded the walls should stand. One might imagine a traumatized population emerging from disaster with a fragmented inheritance, rituals whose purposes are forgotten, measurements whose origins are unknown, stories no longer understood yet too sacred to discard. Such a society would treat ancient instructions not as suggestions but commandments. The king list, then, becomes not mythology, but instruction, a document intended to preserve the memory of an age whose true meaning died with the flood. The compulsive copying of the list supports this view. Scribes transcribed it across centuries, sometimes correcting errors, sometimes preserving inconsistencies without question. They did not attempt to interpret the list, they maintained it. That is the behavior of people who know they are protecting something whose importance exceeds their comprehension. It is not the recording of history, but the safeguarding of legacy. If the king list is a broken mirror, then its shatters reveal the outline of a world before ours, one where knowledge flowed freely, where lifespans spanned epochs, where celestial understanding was not discovery but memory. The Sumerians appear not as inventors but as inheritors of something that predated the destruction that reshaped their reality. Their cities were not experiments, they were restorations. Their temples were not prototypes, they were continuations. Their history was not a beginning, it was a salvage operation. What we call civilization might be nothing more than the surviving embers of a fire that once burned brighter than we can imagine. The king list does not whisper a metaphor. It declares a truth its authors believed beyond doubt. Humanity did not ascend, it returned. If the earliest kings belonged to a world before the waters came, then the question we must ask is no longer whether such a world existed, but why it was destroyed, and how much of it remains hidden beneath the sands of time. Everything about the king list leads inexorably to a single, chilling realization. If the Sumerians were right, then we stand not at the dawn of human history, but at the edge of a long-forgotten aftermath. The flood did not erase our origins, it buried them. And the people who rose in its wake did not create civilization from nothing. They clung to the last fragments of a world whose memory was already slipping away. The king list is not an invention. It is a memorial. It is the voice of a civilization that refused to let oblivion win. It tells us, without metaphor or hesitation, that we are living in the ruins of something older than our history can fathom, and that the story of humanity did not begin where we believe it did. It began somewhere else, in a time so distant that its rulers measured eras, not years, and its knowledge was so immense that only shards of it survived the end of the world. If the king list is a remnant of an age that ended beneath the surge of catastrophic waters, then the flood described by the Sumerians cannot merely be a local myth, nor a poetic metaphor. It must represent something real enough, visceral enough, and devastating enough to have carved its terror into the memory of humanity. And indeed, the land itself remembers. Beneath several ancient cities in Mesopotamia, buried under layers of mud and sediment, there lies a silent testimony, a sheet of sterile clay, devoid of artifacts, severing one civilization from another like a scar. No pottery, no tools, no remnants of everyday life disturb that layer. Above it, Sumer rises. Below it, a vanished world waits in darkness. Something immense happened there. Something powerful enough to halt history, silence cities, and force survivors to begin anew. The archaeologist who first uncovered this geological boundary had not expected to find it. While excavating deep beneath the ancient city of Ur, he believed he had reached natural soil, the untouched earth predating human settlement. But his team dug a little deeper, driven not by hope, but by method. To their astonishment, they found not bedrock but more ruins. Beneath the thick layer of clay lay the traces of a culture older than the one above. This discovery changed everything. It meant that the flood was not a story. It was a watershed, a dividing line between two separate worlds, one annihilated, the other resurrected. The Sumerians treated this event not merely as a calamity, but as the boundary that split existence itself. Their texts do not describe the flood in moralistic language. They do not moralize, preach, or lament. They state it with the clarity of someone identifying a date on a calendar. Before the flood, time moved differently. After the flood, it became mortal. To them, the flood was not judgment, it was erasure. Yet the most confounding detail about this cataclysm is not that the Sumerians recorded it. It is that so many other cultures separated by oceans, mountain ranges, and millennia, tell the same story. The flood ripples through the mythologies of humanity like a wound too deep to heal. Each tradition speaks in its own voice, but the melody is always the same: a world-ending flood, the destruction of a previous age, the survival of a chosen few, and the rebirth of civilization in the wake of ruin. In the ancient texts of Mesopotamia, a man named Ziusudra receives a warning from the gods to build a vessel and preserve life against the rising waters. In a later Akkadian version of the tale, the survivor is called Atrahasis. Other versions name him differently, but his purpose remains unchanged. He bears animals and knowledge through the watery void. These texts do not shy away from detail. They describe measurements for the vessel, instructions for storing food, and rituals performed after the water's retreat. The narrative is chilling, not because it is supernatural, but because of how procedural it is, as though it were an eyewitness report, not a myth. In the Hebrew scriptures, the story appears again, almost unchanged. A righteous man is warned of an impending deluge. He constructs an ark. Pairs of animals accompany him. The world is swept clean of its former ways. When the waters fade, the survivors emerge into a new age, humbled yet preserved. The names differ. The cultural context shifts, but the core structure of the event remains intact. One cannot claim these stories diffused through trade or cultural borrowing, when the ocean separates some of them, and yet, thousands of miles away, among the people of India, legends speak of Manu, forewarned of a flood and instructed to build a boat. When the waters recede, he becomes the progenitor of humankind. Cross the seas again, and you encounter the Maya recounting the destruction of earlier worlds by water. The Aztec cosmology tells of previous creations, washed away until the present age came forth. These cultures never met the Sumerians, never shared temples or gods, never exchanged scriptures, and yet they share the same trauma. Even in far northern lands, where ice rather than desert shapes the horizon, Norse myth tells of a deluge that ends an age. Across the Pacific, Polynesian peoples describe a great inundation. Native American tribes recount the same event in their own words. How could so many stories converge on the same disaster? One explanation is that floods are common, and humans naturally fear them. Rivers swell, storms break, and villages drown. But ordinary floods do not erase civilizations. They do not produce architectural discontinuity, wipe cultural memory, and force the invention of entire languages anew. They do not synchronize myth across continents that never shared a word. These are not stories of inconvenience. They are stories of annihilation. What makes the Sumerian version stand apart is not merely that it may be the oldest written account. It is that their flood appears not as a moral correction, but as a cosmic event dividing eras. The king list treats the flood like a page break. Before it, rulers lived impossibly long lives. After it, they lived as we do. Before it, the world knew things now forgotten. After it, humanity seemed to awaken in a state of amnesia, strained and burdened, yet compelled to resurrect fragments of what once had been. This idea, unsettling as it is, gains weight when viewed alongside geological evidence from the end of the last ice age. Around 12,000 years ago, global sea, levels rose dramatically as glaciers melted. Coastlines changed, rivers swelled. Whole regions that once supported human habitation vanished beneath the waves, now lying drowned under continental shelves. If civilizations existed there, cities along coasts that are now seabeds, their remains would not lie where archaeologists dig today. They would sit beneath the ocean, and the trauma of losing so much land so suddenly would echo for thousands of years. It would take form in stories. It would be carried by survivors. It would become myth, not because it was invented, but because memory outlasts context. The ancient mind could not write scientific hypotheses. It encoded patterns through narrative. It described chaos in the language of gods, because no other vocabulary existed to convey the magnitude of the event. When the Sumerians claimed a flood erased what came before, they were not merely telling a story. They were attempting to preserve a memory they hardly understood. The flood myth, then, is not an invention. It is an inheritance, and if the Sumerians inherited something, they must have done so from people who lived before them. This is where the mystery sharpens into something like inevitability. If Sumer was rebuilding rather than building, then the flood did not merely destroy villages. It severed a continuum of knowledge. It forced humanity to become an heir rather than a creator. The Sumerians spoke repeatedly of a time when knowledge flowed freely. They did not say they invented astronomy, writing, architecture, or mathematics. They said they received them. Their temples were restorations. Their measurements were continuations. Their gods were not originators, but returners. This perspective casts the flood as a hinge that swings civilization from one side of history to the other. Before it, perhaps humanity lived in a world where lifespans were measured not as years but as cycles, where the sky's movements were understood without telescopes, where meanings we struggle to grasp today were obvious. After it, humans lived in the shadow of something lost, trying desperately to salvage fragments. What makes this interpretation so troubling is that nothing in the archaeological record contradicts it. The sudden appearance of cities, writing, and complex governance in Sumer resembles not invention, but recovery. It is as though someone handed them blueprints, and they followed instructions without comprehending where the designs originated. To dismiss all flood myths as mere coincidence requires ignoring the unity of human memory. These stories do not vary in structure so much as they diverge in colour. They are not dozens of different tales. They are dozens of reflections of the same trauma. And trauma leaves marks. It lodges itself in language, ritual, architecture, and cosmology. The flood marks the moment when humanity forgot its past and began to reconstruct it from shards. Those who survived did not understand everything they carried. They preserved what they could, hoping it would matter later. That is exactly what the Sumerians appear to have done. They were not witnesses. They were descendants of witnesses. They stood at the edge of memory, trying to rebuild a world they no longer fully understood, and somehow they succeeded. Just enough for us to glimpse the outlines of something older, something vast, something broken by water and time. If the flood is the wound that separates our age from the one before it, then Sumer is the first civilization that tried to staunch the bleeding. But wounds do not close easily. They ache through centuries. They whisper through myth. And sometimes, when the light hits the clay tablets just right, they speak. What they say is not comforting. They tell us that the world we call ancient was already old when it began, that humanity did not awaken in innocence but in aftermath. They tell us that we are not the first to build cities, nor the first to watch them fall. They tell us that beneath the stories lies a history too vast to hold, too important to forget, and too broken to fully comprehend. And the Sumerians wrote it down, not because they understood it, but because they feared a second forgetting. If the flood was the great severance, the point at which memory dissolved and the world began again, then the Sumerians became the bridge between a forgotten age and the one humanity inherited. Yet the way they describe the beings who oversaw this transition is unlike anything found in civilizations that supposedly came later. The Sumerians did not speak of gods as distant, unknowable forces beyond comprehension. They described beings who walked among them, beings who taught, instructed, bestowed knowledge, and established order with a level of intimacy that blurs the boundary between deity and instructor. To the Sumerians, the gods were not abstract concepts. They were rulers, architects, and administrators. They had councils, responsibilities, and domains that were not merely symbolic. They divided tasks, built cities, apportioned land, issued decrees, and even engaged in disputes that had direct consequences for humanity. At the head of this celestial hierarchy stood beings whose names echo through millennia: Enki, Enlil, Anu, Inanna, and others. These are not vague archetypes. They are portrayed as tangible presences, beings with preferences, mistakes, and rivalries. They interact with mortals, grant kingship, impart laws, and, according to the texts, intervene directly in human affairs. It is no wonder that later mythologies reshaped these figures into gods, because their presence in the earlier Sumerian records challenges any simplistic view of divine metaphor. The Sumerians treated them not as spiritual abstractions, but as figures whose decisions had logistical implications, whose commands were inscribed into the clay tablets that governed life in the cities. The Sumerians claimed that these beings established the first cities, each with a cosmic purpose. Eridu, the earliest of these, was not just a settlement but a sacred locus, the place where order first took root. The texts claim that kingship descended from the heavens into this city, implying that authority itself originated from outside the human domain. Eridu, in their worldview, was not built, it was designated. The city was laid out according to a plan, a blueprint passed down rather than conceived. This idea recurs throughout their mythology. Cities did not arise through trial and error, they were restored, as though previous ones had existed long ago. The Sumerians did not see themselves as inventors of civilization. They saw themselves as guardians of a plan older than memory. Their pantheon served as the custodians of this plan. Enki, known as the god of wisdom and fresh water, is credited with providing humanity with essential arts, writing, metallurgy, irrigation. He is not described as inspiring humans to invent these things, but as giving them, directly, with the clarity of a teacher imparting instruction. Enlil, by contrast, holds dominion over authority and order. It is he who grants kingship, who determines who may rule and for how long. Anu, aloof and distant, embodies a level of command so lofty that his decrees require no explanation. These figures do not behave like mythological abstractions. They behave like administrators of a world that once operated on principles no longer fully understood. Inanna's role is particularly revealing. She's associated with love and war, but these dualities do not reflect contradiction. They reflect complexity. Inanna embodies power, ambition, transformation. In Sumerian tales, she descends into the underworld, negotiates treaties, and engages in political maneuvering that mirrors human court intrigue. Her temples were not built merely for worship. They functioned as economic centers, hubs of trade, storage, and law. The gods did not occupy the heavens as distant overseers. They inhabited the infrastructure of civilization. Their presence was not philosophical, it was municipal. The more one reads of these beings, the less they resemble gods in the modern sense, and the more they resemble the architects of a system. Their powers, though couched in ancient language, appear procedural. They bestow agriculture, establish measurement systems, define marriage laws, and delineate property rights. They behave like founders of institutions, not like figments of imagination. One might assume such stories emerge from simple minds creating explanations for their surroundings, but that does not align with the sophistication of the Sumerian world. People who could track planetary movements to the day, assign base 60 mathematical values to celestial cycles, and construct ziggurats aligned with astronomical bodies were not intellectually naive. They were observant, methodical, and deliberate. What makes the Sumerian gods truly perplexing is how physical they are. Said to have been. They are described eating, drinking, travelling, resting, and engaging in disputes that sound like matters of state rather than cosmic allegory. They depart cities, return to others, relocate their seats of power, and adjust human destiny based on decisions that seem more administrative than divine. They are not unfathomable forces, they are agents of continuity, perpetuating a system that appears inherited rather than invented. It is almost as though the Sumerians were not worshipping deities but honouring memory, preserving the legacy of figures who once played roles in shaping the world before the flood. If one views the gods not through the lens of theology, but through the lens of cultural inheritance, they become less supernatural and more historical. They may represent members of a lost civilization, elevated to mythic status by those who survived the cataclysm that erased their world. To a people rebuilding from fragments, knowledge would appear divine. Those who possessed it would seem immortal. Their actions would echo through ritual and language, reshaping identity long after their presence faded. This interpretation does not diminish the spiritual dimension of Sumerian belief. It contextualizes it. It reveals a society grappling with memory so incomplete that it had no choice but to encode it in the only medium that could preserve meaning across centuries: narrative. The temples the Sumerians constructed reflect this synthesis of reverence and practicality. These were not merely sanctuaries, they were administrative complexes, research centres, and repositories of knowledge. Their foundations anchored not just faith, but order. Priests acted as astronomers, accountants, advisors, and record keepers. They were custodians of information, not intermediaries of abstraction. If civilization was a fragile inheritance, then temples were its vaults. Ziggurats were more than monuments. They were stairways rising from the earth toward the heavens, symbolic bridges between worlds, reminders that something once descended and might ascend again. Their terraces and platforms elevated not merely gods, but ideas that had survived the flood and were now preserved in baked clay. To climb a ziggurat was to ascend through memory, not sky. Each level represented layers of time, strata of knowledge, echoes of a world obscured but not extinguished. The Sumerians believed that humanity existed to maintain this inheritance. Humans were not created accidentally. They were fashioned to manage creation, to organize the world, to keep the cosmic order functioning. Their myths describe early humans living free of toil, only later burdened with labor as part of a divine agreement. This narrative is not unique, yet in Sumer it gains structure. Humanity is not punished, humanity is employed. This conception implies a worldview in which humans are not the pinnacle of existence, but components of a system, participants in an ongoing project, whose origins lie beyond their understanding. The gods did not create humans to worship them. They created humans because something needed maintenance. The Sumerians saw their role as caretakers, not subjects. Their civilization was not an expression of power, but an obligation to memory. This raises an uncomfortable thought. If the Sumerians were not inventing civilization, but restoring it under instruction from beings who once held knowledge humans had forgotten, then the gods may represent a lineage disrupted by catastrophe, a chain broken at its centre. What if the gods were the last custodians of a knowledge system whose origins predate the flood? What if their presence in myth reflects the residue of a world older than recorded history? Civilizations tend to elevate their founders to divine status. Over generations, noble ancestors become heroes, heroes become demigods, and demigods become gods. The Sumerians may have inherited figures whose contributions were so profound that language could not accommodate their significance. The only category large enough to contain them was the divine. Viewed this way, Enki's gifts are not magical, they are technological. Writing, mathematics, agriculture. These are not miracles. They are frameworks. They are instructions for rebuilding. They are the operating manual of a world that no longer existed. The Sumerians did not treat their gods as mysterious forces because they were not mysterious. They were remembered. But memory, like clay, cracks. Over time, meanings shift, stories stretch. What begins as recollection becomes reverence. What begins as reverence becomes religion, and what begins as history becomes myth. Yet the presence of myth does not negate the truth beneath it. It veils it. The Sumerians lived in that veil. They preserved what they could. They encoded what they could not explain. They worshipped what they did not dare forget. Their gods were not fantasies. They were the shadows of something real. And Sumer stood not at the dawn of civilization, but at its dimly lit threshold. If the gods of Sumer were not inventions of mythic imagination, but echoes of figures who once guided humanity, then the artifacts they left behind should reveal the traces of that inheritance. And indeed, scattered throughout ancient Mesopotamia are objects so perplexing, so anachronistic, that they seem to sit like foreign bodies lodged within the archaeological record. These are not isolated curiosities. They form a pattern, a mosaic pointing toward knowledge that should not have existed at the time it was documented. Among these artifacts, some appear mundane at first, so ordinary that their significance hides in plain sight. Others, however, seem to peer back at us, challenging our assumptions with unsettling confidence, as though whispering, "You do not understand the world as well as you think you do." One of the most striking examples is a small, palm-sized clay tablet, that depicts the solar system, not from the perspective of Earth, but from a position outside of it. The symbols etched upon the tablet show the sun at the center, surrounded by planetary bodies in a configuration uncannily reminiscent of what we know today. In Sumerian cosmology, the heavens were not an abstract dome but a structured realm. The Sumerians knew of planetary orbits, and they recognized celestial bodies invisible to the naked eye. The existence of this knowledge has confounded researchers for decades. If the Sumerians were the first civilization, who taught them the architecture of the cosmos? Another artifact equally enigmatic is a list of stars aligned with constellations that remain recognizable today. The Sumerians did not merely name these celestial formations, they understood their movements. They recorded the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon requiring careful observation over thousands of years. This is not the behavior of a culture awakening from ignorance. This is the signature of a people continuing a tradition. One does not learn the rhythm of the heavens in a single generation. It requires continuity, discipline, and a sense of purpose. It requires inheritance. Their mathematics reveals the same strange phenomenon. The Sumerian base 60 system, so elegant and versatile that we still use it to measure time and angles, does not behave like an early number system. Primitive systems evolve from simple roots, 1, 2, 3, accumulating complexity over time. But Sumer begins with complexity already in place. Their multiplication tables are fully developed. Their geometry is functional. Their astronomical tables track Venus with accuracy. Modern astronomers did not match until the age of telescopes. None of this emerges from experimentation. It emerges from history, from something carried forward. Their knowledge of metallurgy appears similarly inherited. Bronze is not a simple material. It requires copper and tin, sourced from different regions and combined in precise ratios. Too much tin, and the metal becomes brittle. Too little, and it lacks strength. The Sumerians achieved the correct formula at the very beginning of their Bronze Age. They did not fumble through alloys. They did not test and fail. They began with the solution. This is the hallmark of memory, not invention. One could argue that these achievements reflect genius, that the Sumerians were an unprecedented spark of humanity's brilliance. But genius leaves fingerprints. It evolves. It falters. It stretches toward discovery through missteps and tangents. Nothing in Sumer demonstrates this climb. Everything arrives already at the summit. Compounding the mystery are the stone artifacts carved long after the initial rise of Sumer, yet echoing ideas that seem almost prehistoric. Among them are depictions of beings that do not resemble humans, creatures shown wearing garments or devices that provoke strange questions. Their heads are elongated, their postures are upright, and in many cases they hold objects shaped like satchels or containers, always in the same style, always in the same position. From Mesopotamia to later civilizations, these bag-like symbols recur with eerie consistency. What knowledge did these figures carry in those bags? Why did so many cultures mimic the same iconography? Why are these motifs identical across continents, whose inhabitants never shared language, religion, or trade? In Sumerian reliefs, humans stand beside towering figures who wear elaborate garments and what appear to be wrist-bound implements. These are not amorphous, indistinct depictions. They are detailed, they are specific, and in every case the humans look up at them, not figuratively, literally. The beings are taller, they command presence, they instruct, they demonstrate. The Sumerians did not portray their gods in the sky. They portrayed them beside temples, within cities, engaging in what looks like administration. Their deities are not ethereal, they are tangible. Consider now the curious detail of how the Sumerians depicted kings. They did not show them as supreme rulers. They showed them kneeling before these beings, receiving symbols of authority. The kings were intermediaries, not originators. Their power was transfused, not earned. This does not reflect a theology of imagination. It reflects a memory of structure. What is most disquieting is how these depictions appear not only in Sumer, but in cultures that arose after it. Across ancient Egypt, the earliest carvings show pharaohs receiving instruction from tall, elaborate figures. In Mesoamerica, similar beings hand down knowledge to the first humans. In the Indus Valley, seals portray humanoid figures with strange attire and objects whose purpose we cannot decipher. These cultures share no direct lineage, yet their imaginations converge again and again on the same prototype. Tall figures, bearing knowledge, accompanied by symbols, holding strange devices, teaching humanity what to do. Coincidence does not behave so consistently. The deeper one descends into the past, the more fragmented the details become, and yet the pattern remains. Someone, somewhere, provided instruction. Whether that someone was human, superhuman, or something our vocabulary cannot yet hold, the imprint endures like a fossil. Even the Sumerian language itself hints at discontinuity. It is unrelated to any known linguistic family. It does not branch into daughter languages. It has no identifiable ancestors. It appears abruptly, fully formed like a transplanted tree without roots. Languages do not behave this way. They evolve, mutating through influences and migrations. Sumerian does not. It stands alone, as though imported intact. The Sumerians did not create language. They continued one. Their writing system reflects the same anomaly. The earliest cuneiform tablets show mastery, not struggle. The complex interweaving of phonetic and logographic symbols requires not just creativity, but time. Time enough for refinement, error, correction, and refinement again. But Sumerian writing appears as though evoked from memory. It is almost as if the Sumerians were not learning how to express themselves, but attempting to preserve what they had been taught. The weight of these facts does not force one conclusion, it invites one. Civilization did not spring spontaneously from the soil of Mesopotamia. It rose there like a garden regrown from seeds that survived a fire. The Sumerians planted what they remembered. They nurtured what remained. And the knowledge that blossomed was not new. It was old. This becomes even more apparent when examining their worldview. The Sumerians did not claim their gods created humanity out of affection or aesthetic whim. They wrote that humans were created to carry burdens, to maintain order, to perform labour once done by others. This idea, unsettling as it is, contrasts sharply with later interpretations that romanticize divine creation. Human beings, in the Sumerian view, were functional. They had purpose. They were not vessels for divine glory. They were tools to prevent chaos. One can imagine a society emerging from catastrophe. Survivors gather, bearing fragments of knowledge too valuable to lose. They assign roles, create institutions, preserve rituals whose meanings they no longer fully comprehend. They elevate those who once carried wisdom to a level of reverence so intense it becomes indistinguishable from deity. In such a world, stories are not invented. They are safeguarded. They hold what language cannot articulate, what trauma cannot bear directly. The Sumerians lived in that twilight of remembrance. They inherited a world they did not build, and their greatest fear was losing it again. Their gods are not expressions of faith. They are expressions of anxiety. They are the memory of something greater, carried forward as myth only because myth was the only container large enough to hold it. To modernize, these stories seemed strange, fantastical, impossible. But impossibility is an illusion created by perspective. What seems improbable today may have been evident yesterday. What seems miraculous may once have been mundane. If a world existed before ours, and if it was destroyed, then what we call myth may be the debris of history. The Sumerians preserved the debris. They pressed it into clay. They built temples around it. They aligned cities to embody it. They lived not at the birth of civilization, but in the afterimage of a world that had already died. The question is no longer whether the Sumerians invented civilization. It is whether they remembered it. And if they remembered it, then something came before. If the Sumerians were the inheritors of a broken legacy, then the question that now hovers over their civilization like a shadow is not what they knew, but what they tried to hide. Knowledge does not vanish gently. It erodes under pressure, it fragments under trauma, it retreats into ritual, when language fails to contain it. And when a society fears the loss of meaning, it encodes secrets in symbols, myths, and sacred architecture. In the case of Sumer, what we see is a civilization that did not merely record, it concealed. Their tablets speak openly, yet their meaning lies behind a veil. Their ziggurats rise into the sky, yet their foundations point downward, as though their true purpose is not ascent but remembrance. To understand the Sumerians, One must learn to read their silence as carefully as their words. The architecture of their cities reveals an anxiety invisible at first glance. Each city was constructed according to a cosmic blueprint, not improvised, not adapted through trial and error. Eridu, Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur. Every one of these urban centres followed a pattern. The temples stood not where terrain permitted, but where the heavens demanded. Alignments of walls and corridors reflect astronomical calculations that could not have emerged spontaneously. They were not guessing. They were replicating. Something in their past had convinced them that the structure of civilization required precision, that deviation would not merely offend the gods but destabilize reality. Consider for a moment what kind of catastrophe would ingrain such caution into a civilization's bones. A flood that erased not only cities, but memory. A moment when the world ended, and survivors knew only fragments of the order it once obeyed. If you emerge from such devastation with scraps of instruction, would you innovate or preserve? Would you create, or would you fear that any mistake might unleash chaos once more? The Sumerians chose to preserve. They clung to the remnants of the world that preceded them with such desperation that every brick became a prayer, every measurement an attempt to ward off forgetting. Their temples functioned not as places of worship in the modern sense, but as repositories of knowledge. They were machines of memory. The priests were not prophets. They were archivists. They recorded contracts, tracked astronomical movements, maintained ledgers of goods, and enforced laws that seemed to predate the cities themselves. If a culture invents law, its early versions are chaotic, inconsistent, and experimental. Sumerian law was structured from the beginning. It did not evolve from primitive codes. It appeared polished. It appeared inherited. Their pantheon reflects the same pattern. Each deity governs not an abstract concept, but an institution. Enki presides over wisdom and the subterranean waters, yet his myths depict him as the originator of crafts and organization. Enlil is lord of authority and command, yet his narratives show him shaping kingship, granting reigns, and determining the fates of cities. Inanna governs sexuality and warfare, yet behaves like a strategist and diplomat. Her actions read like political maneuvers. These gods are not metaphors. They are roles that would have been held by individuals before memory turned them into symbols. When society forgets the face of a founder, it canonizes them. When it forgets their voice, it sanctifies their words. When it forgets their purpose, it invents devotion. If Sumer was a society trying to reconstruct something it barely remembered, then the gods were not an invention to explain nature. They were placeholders for functions that no longer had names. By worshipping them, the Sumerians ensured that no institution, no art, no measurement, no law would be lost again. Their religion was not belief, it was insurance. The persistence of this structure becomes even more striking when one considers how quickly Sumerian influence spread across the ancient world. Egypt, emerging after Sumer, inherits monumental architecture, irrigation expertise, and a conception of kingship that mirrors the structure found in Mesopotamia. In the Indus Valley, seals and symbols echo Sumerian motifs, and urban design reflects similar priorities. Across the Mediterranean, the myths of Greece preserve shadows of Sumerian stories, though reframed through new languages. Even the Bible carries Sumer's fingerprints, not because it borrowed from them, but because both emerge from a common memory. These parallels do not imply cultural plagiarism, they imply shared trauma. Civilizations built by survivors will mirror each other if their memories originate from the same disaster. If the flood was real, not a metaphor but a world-ending event, then those who endured would scatter, carrying fragments of the world that drowned. They would rebuild where land permitted. They would cling to whatever meaning survived. If Sumer was the first to do so successfully, it became the lighthouse, the first beacon of recovered knowledge in a darkened world. The more one studies the ancient Mesopotamian texts, the more apparent it becomes that the Sumerians were not comfortable with the knowledge they carried. Their myths contain warnings. Humanity is repeatedly portrayed as fragile, replaceable, easily overwhelmed by forces beyond comprehension. The gods debate whether humans are worthy of their existence. Civilization teeters constantly on the brink of reversion into chaos. The Sumerians wrote not with confidence, but with fear. This fear manifests in their obsession with measurement. They quantified everything: time, property, crops, labour, celestial motion. They believed that what could be measured could be controlled. What could be controlled could be preserved. Their number system, based on 60, remains one of the most useful humans have ever devised. It is ideal for dividing circles and tracking astronomical cycles. Yet no written evidence exists of the trial and error phase that created it. The system arrives whole, executed perfectly, as though carried intact from another epoch. Why would a newly formed civilization choose such a complex base, rather than the intuitive decimal system based on fingers? Why not invent something simpler? The answer is clear once one abandons the illusion of Sumerian invention. They did not choose, they remembered. One can almost imagine their struggle. Survivors staring at the remnants of knowledge they do not fully understand, trying to maintain a system whose purpose has slipped from collective memory. The number 60 would have seemed arbitrary to them, until they relearned its power. Their gods did not teach them mathematics. Mathematics was the gods' language. The Sumerians documented rituals with painstaking care. They feared mispronunciation, misalignment, or miscalculation. These rituals were not mystical acts, they were procedures. Each movement, each word, each offering was a line of inherited code. To deviate was to risk losing contact with a structure they could not explain but dared not abandon. Their writing reflects the same urgency. Cuneiform was not created gradually. It emerged as though resurrected. Its earliest versions are not crude, childlike attempts at inscription. They are organized, dense, and precise. Writing was not a discovery. It was a recovery. The Sumerian worldview suggests a people who grew up in the ruins of something vast, something that had once stretched far beyond their comprehension. They saw themselves not as founders, but as restorers of a world shattered by forces they could neither name nor resist. To them, history did not begin, it resumed. Everything they built can be understood through this lens. Their temples were attempts to reconnect with a lost order. Their laws were efforts to stabilize a broken identity. Their gods were echoes of forgotten leaders. Their myths were encrypted instructions. Their science was memory rendered into mathematics. This inversion changes everything. If Sumer did not originate civilization, then the origin lies elsewhere, perhaps beneath oceans, beneath layers of mud, beneath the amnesia of millennia. The Sumerians shine not as the first inventors, but as the final inheritors. They kept the last embers of a fire whose blaze we have never seen. Their unease becomes understandable. They lived with the burden of memory but without the clarity of understanding. They were custodians of something they could not fully interpret. Every breakthrough, every achievement, every structure they created was a translation from fragments they could not contextualize. If the Sumerians were the first to wake after the world drowned, then the world did not begin with them. It began before them. Their civilization was not Genesis, it was recovery. If all of this is true, if the Sumerians were not the dawn of civilization, but the first flicker after a terrible night, then the implications stretch far beyond Mesopotamia. It means that the story of humanity is not linear. It is cyclical, fractured, interrupted. It means that what we call progress may not be progress at all, but rediscovery, a slow remembering of something once known. It forces us to confront a possibility that feels almost forbidden, that humanity may be older, wiser, and more complex than the timelines carved into textbooks suggest. The Sumerians did not behave like pioneers. They behaved like archivists. They guarded knowledge as though it was sacred because to them it was. They feared forgetting more than ignorance. Their rituals, their language, their architecture, all were designed to protect memory. And memory, if one looks closely enough, is the central character of their civilization. The tablets they left behind are not just records. They are survival strategies. They contain fragments of stories that do not begin where they start. They assume an earlier context, a missing prologue, as though the scribes themselves were writing in the middle of a sentence. Imagine a civilization emerging not from innocence but from loss. Imagine waking into a world stripped of its past, haunted by knowledge you cannot fully understand, and driven by the fear that what little remains will disappear. That was Sumer. It was not the first attempt at civilization. It was the first attempt to salvage it. The remnants of that earlier world linger like fingerprints on damp clay. They appear in measurements humans still use, in myths told by cultures that never met, in ruins resting beneath the sea, in languages that arrive fully formed, in symbols that repeat across continents without explanation. These fragments point towards an origin story that did not end with a beginning, but with a catastrophe. And when that catastrophe struck, those who survived were forced to restart civilization using pieces of a puzzle they could no longer see in full. This idea has always been uncomfortable for modern scholarship because it resists neat categorization. It demands humility. It demands that we admit we might be missing a chapter of human history. A chapter erased not by oversight, but by disaster. The Sumerians never pretended otherwise. They lived with the weight of remembrance pressing on their temples. They spoke of a time before recorded time, a world washed away, a lineage severed. They knew they were not inventors, they were custodians. The modern world looks back at Sumer as though it were the first flicker of genius. But genius does not appear fully armed with mathematics, architecture, astronomy, written law, and bureaucratic administration. Genius experiments. Genius evolves, Sumer resumed. Their brilliance was not a spark, it was an ember. The more one studies their culture, the more one realizes that their greatest struggle was not survival, but interpretation. They were heirs to something they could not completely decode. Their gods, their tablets, their rituals, all are attempts to bridge a gap between what they were taught and what they could comprehend. They lived in a world populated by reminders of something monumental, yet obscured. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of Sumer is not what they said, but what they did not say. They did not explain the origins of their knowledge because they did not know them. They ascribed invention to beings whose names they preserved, not whose forms they remembered. They did not trace the roots of writing, mathematics, or astronomy, because for them these things were not created. They were received. What would it feel like to live in such a world? To possess a technology you can use but cannot explain? To replicate rituals whose purposes elude you? To worship figures whose faces have blurred with time? It would feel like living in the ruins of greatness, surrounded by monuments you did not build, fearful that if you stopped maintaining them, the world itself might falter. This fear of collapse permeates Sumerian culture. Their gods are capricious, their kings mortal, their institutions vulnerable. They revered order because they had seen what happens when order vanishes. In this sense, the Sumerians were not arrogant. They were anxious. They did not seek to rule the world. They sought to prevent it from ending again. Their legacy stretches forward in time like a thread woven into every culture that followed. The Egyptians inherited monumental architecture and cosmic kingship. The Greeks inherited epic narratives and divine councils. The Hebrews inherited flood memory and genealogical history. India inherited cosmic cycles and layered creation. China inherited bureaucratic order and sacred administration. All of these cultures believed they received something, not invented something. They regarded civilization not as achievement, but as inheritance. The modern world, enamored with the myth of progress, rejects this idea. We take pride in assuming we stand atop the apex of human development. But the ruins of Sumer whisper otherwise. They whisper that we are rediscovering, not discovering. That our inventions are echoes, that our insights are recollections. Consider the way humanity behaves when faced with mystery. We assume we're moving forward, forging new paths. But every major leap, writing, mathematics, architecture, agriculture, astronomy, appears first in Sumer fully formed. Everything that defines civilization arrives not slowly, not experimentally, but suddenly. Humanity did not ascend step by step. It restarted. Which leads to the final and most unsettling question. If the Sumerians were rebuilding, who built before them? The answer does not lie in their words. It lies in their silence. It lies in the gaps of their mythology, in the absences of their language, in the unspoken certainty that something came before. The Sumerians did not document the origins of civilization because those origins were not theirs to record. Those origins were gone. Their civilization then becomes a monument to forgetting. Not the forgetting of trivial matters, but the forgetting of identity. The flood did not destroy land alone, it destroyed lineage. Humanity began again not because it wanted to, but because it had no choice. The Sumerians were not the ancestors of civilization. They were its orphans, and yet despite the terror of that inheritance, they managed something extraordinary. They held on. They remembered enough. They preserved fragments so that when humanity was ready, it could piece together what was lost. They did not understand everything they carried, but they carried it anyway. They became the hinge upon which human history turns. Not the beginning, but the point where the past opens again. To look upon their tablets with modern eyes is to glimpse a world we were not meant to see. A world that ended, a world that waits, a world whose memory calls out from baked clay, whispering warnings we cannot fully decipher. The Sumerians did not ask us to believe them. They asked us not to forget. And perhaps that is the true origin of humanity. Not the moment we invented civilization, but the moment we understood that civilization could end. The Sumerians lived with that knowledge, we do not. But their tablets remain patient, silent, eternal. They are the last embers of a fire older than history, waiting for someone to notice the smoke. There is a peculiar silence that surrounds ancient history, a kind of pause between facts where something unnamed seems to breathe. When scholars speak of the earliest civilizations, they do so with a strange confidence, as though the past were a fixed thing, an object pinned beneath glass. Yet the deeper one descends into the archaeology of time, the more this certainty dissolves. The past is not a straight road, it is a labyrinth, and at its centre lies a truth that humanity once knew and later forgot. Imagine a world where memory itself is fragile, where the stories that shape reality drift like sand across a desert. The Sumerians lived in such a world. To them the past was not gone. It lurked beneath their feet, buried under layers of clay and catastrophe. They walked on the grave of an age that had ended long before they were born, and though they could not see its cities or hear its voices, they felt its presence in every stone they placed, every symbol they carved, every law they enforced. They were heirs to something they barely understood. In that sense, Sumer was less a beginning than a reconstruction. Their myths do not claim invention, they claim return. They speak of a time before the flood, before kingship descended, before the world fractured into shards. They describe an era when knowledge was abundant, when humanity lived in harmony with forces now called divine, when reality was not yet divided between mortal and immortal. That age, whatever it was, vanished in water and ruin. What remained were fragments, too heavy to ignore, too incomplete to comprehend. This burden shaped the Sumerian psyche. Their stories pulse with anxiety, not pride. Their gods fight, negotiate, suffer, and decree, as though everything they do is an attempt to maintain a fragile order. The Sumerians were not celebrating a golden age. They were coping with the loss of one. Their language makes this grief tangible. It is a language without ancestors, one that appears suddenly, like a survivor who has forgotten their homeland but remembers the accent of its forgotten tongue. It contains concepts that seem older than the very society that used them, names for measurements, celestial cycles, and divine decrees that feel inherited rather than devised. Their words do not evolve. They preserve. This sense of preservation permeates every level of Sumerian culture. Their cities were not random agglomerations of dwellings. They were arranged like diagrams, each aligned with stars, rivers, or sacred geometry. Their temples were not merely places of worship. They were archives of cosmic order, machines of memory disguised in baked brick and bitumen. Their priests were not mystics. They were technicians of tradition, performing rituals that had outlived their original purpose, like musicians playing a symphony whose composer is unknown. The Sumerians did not ask why such rituals existed. They asked how to perform them correctly. The question of origin belonged to a past too distant to matter. What mattered was continuity. What mattered was obedience to patterns older than thought. To modern eyes, this might seem superstitious. To the Sumerians, it was survival. They were like sailors navigating a sea without stars, guided only by fragments of a map drawn in another age. The flood that ended the world before theirs had not merely destroyed cities. It had destroyed meaning, and meaning, once lost, is the hardest treasure to reclaim. Yet the Sumerians reclaimed enough to build something formidable. Their laws, their calendars, their writing system. Each stands like a pillar supporting a structure whose architect is unknown. When we encounter these achievements today, we marvel at their sophistication, but we misunderstand their nature. They are not inventions, they are reconstructions. They are the bones of an ancient creature whose flesh has long since rotted away. When the first archaeologists uncovered the tablets of Sumer, they expected primitive scribbles from a people taking their first steps into literacy. Instead, they found a fully formed script, capable of expressing nuance, abstraction, and political complexity. It was like finding not a child's first words, but the pages of a philosophy long out of print. The same is true of their mathematics. No crude attempts at counting, no developmental arc. Fully developed base 60 calculations, celestial cycles, stellar coordinates, as though someone handed them tools whose purpose they did not fully grasp, and they used them anyway, because the memory of doing so felt more reliable than ignorance. And so we arrive at the heart of the mystery. If the Sumerians were rebuilding, then what was destroyed? Their myths provide an answer, though cloaked in symbol. They speak of beings not born on earth, of realms beyond the mortal plane, of knowledge descending, rather than ascending. To dismiss these as fantasies is to misunderstand myth. Myths are not false stories. They are encoded truths, memories too vast for the tongue to hold. When a civilization loses context, myth becomes the only container large enough to carry the remnants of what once was. The Sumerians may not have known the full truth behind their stories, but they understood this. Humanity had lived before. Humanity had fallen before, and humanity would rise again only by remembering. Memory, then, is the true protagonist of their history. Not the kings, not the gods, not the cities. Memory. For without memory, civilization is an illusion. Modern culture believes it is the first to awaken, the first to understand the heavens, the first to build towers of steel and reach for the stars. But Sumer whispers another possibility, a quieter, more haunting one. We are not rising. We are returning. Look closely at the patterns of our age. Our buildings climb higher. Our cities pulse with complexity. Our technologies expand beyond our comprehension. But beneath this ascent lies a question we cannot answer. Why do we build what we build? Why does humanity pursue order, law, measurement, astronomy, narrative? The very foundations Sumer guarded with such desperation. Is it invention or instinct? The Sumerians would have said neither. They would have said it is memory awakening. Perhaps our civilizations are not milestones but echoes. Perhaps our achievements are not new but recovered. Perhaps the past is not behind us but beneath us, buried under silt and silence, waiting for someone to remember. And if this is true, then the greatest danger humanity faces is not ignorance. It is forgetting. The Sumerians lived with this fear. They carved their warnings into clay, trusting that something solid might endure where minds might falter. Their tablets are not relics. They are anchors. We hold those anchors now, and though we pretend to understand them, the truth is simpler and more unsettling. We are not the first chapter of the human story. We are the continuation of a sentence begun in an age drowned by time. There is a peculiar rhythm to human history, a pulse that beats beneath the surface of time. Empires rise, empires fall, and across the ruins of each age, a new one takes shape. Never entirely new, never entirely old. It is as though humanity walks through a hall of mirrors, each reflection showing a slightly altered version of the same face. The Sumerians sensed this pattern. They felt it in the bones of their cities, in the words of their myths, in the tremors of a world struggling to remember itself. To them, time was not a straight line, it was a wheel. If one listens carefully, one can almost hear this wheel turning. The Sumerians captured its echoes in their stories of kingship descending from the heavens, of knowledge bestowed rather than discovered, of floods that erase and return, of civilizations that awaken from dreams rather than rising from nothingness. These are not metaphors, they are memories, frayed and incomplete, but memories nonetheless. And memories always seek recognition. Perhaps this is why the Sumerians built their world with such urgency. Their temples, their laws, their calendars, all feel like attempts to stabilize something that was constantly slipping from their grasp. They lived with the awareness that the world had ended once, and that endings can come without warning. This knowledge haunted them. It shaped their rituals. It defined their fears. What they sought was not power, but continuity. They wanted assurance that the next flood, literal or metaphorical, would not sweep away everything again. Their inscriptions hint at this anxiety. The gods debate whether humanity deserves to exist. Kings pray not for glory, but for the ability to maintain order. Priests record not visions of paradise, but instructions for survival. Their stories are filled with warnings. Those who forget are doomed to repeat. Those who ignore the lessons of the past invite disaster. Theirs was a civilization built on vigilance rather than ambition. But vigilance is exhausting. Over generations, the memory of catastrophe fades. Ritual becomes habit. Symbols become decoration. Meaning erodes. The Sumerians, for all their efforts, were not immune to this erosion. Their world, like the one before it, eventually fractured. Their cities fell. Their gods changed names. Their language receded into silence. What they preserved endured, but what they understood dissolved. And yet, they left behind something astonishing. The idea that civilization is cyclical, not progressive, but recursive. Not ascending, but remembering. This idea, preserved in clay and myth, travelled farther than their armies ever did. It seeped into the cultures that followed, into Egypt's obsession with eternity, into India's cosmic time cycles, into Greece's golden ages, into the Hebrew sense of exile and return, into the Mesoamerican sense of suns and epochs. Everywhere one looks, the same idea appears in different clothing. The world ends, the world begins again. Modern thought resists this notion. We prefer the comfort of a narrative in which we are the culmination, the apex, the final chapter. But the ancient world whispers something else. It suggests that we are living in yet another cycle, one whose ending is not ahead of us, but beneath us. If humanity once reached heights we do not yet comprehend, if there were technologies, sciences, or ways of seeing the world that we have forgotten, then our present achievements are not unprecedented. They are rediscoveries. They are inevitable waypoints along a trajectory the human mind is wired to follow. The Sumerians did not stumble into civilization. They retraced it. This idea reframes everything. It transforms history from a ladder into a spiral. It suggests that the ruins we uncover are not beginnings, but reminders. It implies that the seeds of our future lie buried in the past, not scattered ahead of us like breadcrumbs. Consider the strange familiarity of modern obsession with knowledge, construction, exploration. Why do humans build monuments that scrape the sky? Why do we peer into the stars seeking answers in distant constellations? Why do we measure time, record laws, preserve stories? These behaviors do not emerge randomly. They are compulsions. They are echoes of something ancient stirring within us. The Sumerians felt this stirring more acutely than any culture we know. Their civilization was positioned at the moment memory reawakened. They did not invent the wheel, the city, or the written word. They remembered them. Their tablets record not revelations, but reminders. They did not ask, what can humanity become? They asked, what did humanity lose? And this question lingers, unresolved, like a thread hanging from the hem of history. Every time a new ruin is found, every time a submerged city is discovered beneath the waves, every time an artifact appears where it should not logically exist, the thread is tugged again. Something below our awareness strains to surface. Something wants to be remembered. Perhaps this is why humanity dreams of Atlantis, of lost continents, of forgotten ages. Perhaps we are not inventing these dreams. Perhaps they are memories rising like bubbles from the deep. The human mind does not yearn for things it has never tasted. Longing is always the shadow of experience. So what, then, did the Sumerians inherit? What shape did the world have before the flood erased its form? Was it a world of cities aligned with the stars, of languages shared across continents, of technologies we cannot yet name? Or was it something stranger, something not built of stone and metal, but of perception. A way of seeing reality that we lost when the waters came. The Sumerians provide no direct answers. They did not understand the legacy they carried. They only knew that their predecessors were powerful, knowledgeable, and undone. They knew that whatever force destroyed the last world could return, and they feared that humanity, left to its own devices, forgets far faster than it learns. Their fear was justified. We have forgotten more than we remember. Our histories are patchworks of narrative stitched together from ruins we barely comprehend. We call the earliest civilizations primitive, because doing so protects us from confronting a possibility we find intolerable, that we are not as advanced as we believe, that what we call discovery is recollection, that we are not rising for the first time, but climbing back to altitudes once familiar. If this is true, then the Sumerians were not an anomaly, they were a warning. Their world ended not because it failed, but because it forgot. It forgot the principles that sustained it. It forgot the patterns that protected it. And when memory faltered, chaos bloomed. We like to imagine that knowledge is permanent, but knowledge is fragile. It survives only when it is valued, preserved, and understood. The Sumerians preserved knowledge, but over time they ceased to understand it. Once that happened, their civilization unraveled, not through warfare or famine, but through amnesia. And now, thousands of years later, we stand where they once stood, surrounded by wonders we do not fully understand, guided by technologies we use but cannot explain, dependent on systems whose origins we ignore. Like them, we believe ourselves at the beginning of something grand. Like them, we feel invincible. Like them, we forget. The tablets of Sumer endure as quiet reminders. They do not preach. They do not threaten. They simply hold space for truth. They wait for someone, anyone, to notice the patterns. They tell us that the past was not simple. They tell us that humanity has risen and fallen before. They tell us that memory is the fulcrum of existence. And if we listen closely, they tell us something else. Something that feels less like history and more like prophecy. Civilization does not die when knowledge is lost. It dies when the will to remember is extinguished. The Sumerians remembered just enough to build again. The question now is whether we will do the same. There are moments in history when humanity seems to stand at a threshold without realizing it. A subtle shift occurs, so quiet that no one alive understands what has changed until long after it has already happened. Only later, when the echoes stretch across centuries, do we recognize that something fundamental was lost, or gained, or perhaps merely remembered. The civilizations of the ancient world felt these thresholds deeply. Their myths are filled with warnings about forgetting, about turning away from what once was known. No culture embodied this awareness more profoundly than Sumer. To live in Sumer was to inhabit a world surrounded by ghosts, not spirits of the dead, but remnants of knowledge, fragments of a reality older than memory. The Sumerians did not merely believe the past existed, they felt it. They sensed it beneath the soil, above the stars, and within the patterns of life itself. Their world was not anchored in the present. It was tethered to something vast, something dimly remembered, something that waited like an unfinished story. In this way, Sumer resembled a civilization awakening from a dream it did not fully understand. The people walked among relics of meaning they had not created, guided by systems they could not explain, and compelled by instincts older than their language. They charted the heavens not because they sought wonder, but because they feared chaos. They built temples not to praise gods, but to appease memory. Every ritual, every law, every structure was an attempt to keep something from slipping away. But what was it they feared losing? Perhaps it was not knowledge in the sense we understand it. Knowledge can be written on tablets, stored in archives, catalogued and copied. No, the Sumerians feared the loss of something more elusive, orientation, a sense of where humanity stands in the cosmos. They believed the world once possessed a kind of alignment, a harmony between heaven and earth, between mortal and divine. This balance had been shattered, and the flood, whether literal or metaphorical, was not merely destruction. It was dislocation. Humanity survived, yes, but it emerged unmoored. Imagine surviving catastrophe but losing the map that explains your existence. You remember only that something was different before, something greater, something clearer, but you cannot recall what it was or why it mattered. This is the Sumerian condition. They did not remember their origin. They remembered that they had forgotten, and so they built. Their architecture was not an expression of aesthetics. It was an attempt to re-establish cosmic order. Ziggurats, with their terraces rising into the sky, were not monuments to power. They were restorations of a link between heaven and earth. Their alignment with stars, seasons, and sacred directions were not coincidences, nor arbitrary choices. They were acts of repair. The Sumerians did not simply erect cities. They reconstructed a world view. Their gods were not distant, invisible beings. They were roles, offices, functions, responsibilities, manifestations of order that had existed long before humans took their first breath. These beings did not create the world. They organized it. They imposed structure on chaos, and the Sumerians, in turn, inherited the responsibility of maintaining that structure. If one reads their myths without preconceptions, a strange picture emerges. Humanity is not created to worship. Humanity is created to work, to maintain gardens, canals, temples, rituals, to prevent collapse. In this interpretation, the Sumerian gods are not omnipotent creators, but custodians of an earlier system. They pass along tasks they can no longer accomplish alone. Humanity becomes a partner in remembrance. The modern mind recoils from this idea. We prefer narratives in which we are central, chosen, destined, but the Sumerians possessed no such arrogance. Their worldview was grounded in responsibility, not entitlement. Humanity was part of a chain, not the apex of it. Such humility may appear primitive, yet it contains a subtle wisdom. If civilization is cyclical, then pride is the destroyer, not ignorance. To believe oneself first is to forget those who came before. To forget is to repeat. The Sumerians did not claim to be first. They claimed to be next. Their anxiety was justified. For civilizations do not fall because they lack strength. They fall because they lose coherence. They stop remembering why their systems exist. Ritual becomes ceremony. Ceremony becomes superstition. Meaning evaporates, leaving only form, and eventually the form collapses too. We see this pattern everywhere. Once mighty empires litter history like broken statues whose inscriptions nobody reads. The world continues, but memory does not. If knowledge is a thread, history is a tapestry woven again and again, each time missing more of the original design. The Sumerians attempted to preserve the thread. Their tablets were an act of desperation, as much as devotion. They hoped that if the next flood came, whether of water or war, ignorance or arrogance, their words would remain as seeds waiting to take root once more. It is ironic, then, that we discover their tablets only after thousands of years and approach them as curiosities rather than warnings. We mine them for data, for myths, for entertainment, but rarely for instruction. We do not recognize that they speak not only of their world, but of ours. We too live in a moment where systems outpace understanding. We build technologies whose origins we barely comprehend. We depend on networks we cannot repair. We assume our knowledge is permanent. So did those who came before. The Sumerians would have seen our age and recognized it instantly, not as progress, but as pattern. They might have whispered caution, reminding us that civilizations do not collapse when enemies attack. They collapse when memories fail, when the thread breaks. Their message, though ancient, carries modern urgency. Humanity does not survive through innovation. It survives through continuity, through the ability to remember what matters, not merely record what happens. Perhaps this is why the Sumerians feel so strange and familiar at once. They are not a distant ancestor. They are a reflection of us, a mirror held up across time showing what it looks like when a civilization wakes into a world built by forgotten hands. We are walking that path again, not forward, but around. And somewhere, beneath the soil of our ambitions, the past waits. It does not ask to be worshipped. It asks to be remembered. For memory, not invention, is the true beginning of civilization, and forgetting, not destruction, is its end. There is an uncanny quality to the past, a sensation that it is never quite gone, never truly silent. Even when civilizations crumble, When cities return to dust and languages fall still, something lingers. It waits between stones, beneath riverbeds, inside stories whispered long after the storytellers have turned to bones. The past is not a grave, it is a reservoir, and every so often humanity dips into its depths without understanding what it draws up. The Sumerians drank from that reservoir, not willingly perhaps, but inevitably. Something called to them from beneath the mud, from the shattered remnants of a world that had drowned long before their cities rose. They inherited tools they did not invent, rituals they could not explain, systems of measurement whose logic predated their own imagination. They believed they were restoring what had always existed, not creating something new. And in that belief lies the most unsettling truth of all. Perhaps they were right. What if human civilization does, not progress, but remembers? What if our greatest innovations are not leaps forward, but returns to forgotten thresholds? Every discovery, writing, agriculture, architecture, law, could be less a spark of genius than the slow resurfacing of something once common, once obvious, and now foreign only because we stand so far from our own beginnings. The Sumerians lived close enough to those beginnings that the echoes had not yet faded. Their gods were not metaphysical abstractions. They had names, roles, and histories. They arrived, departed, taught, punished, and ruled. They interacted with humanity in ways that resemble instruction more than revelation. Their presence in the Sumerian mind was not faith, it was recollection. We, modern inheritors, struggle to interpret these beings. We dismiss them as metaphors or projections because we cannot accept the alternative, that the ancients remembered something real, something with form and intention. But memory, like a river, branches. Some tributaries run clear, others muddy. Over time, the origin becomes harder to trace. To the Sumerians, the gods were real not because they could be seen, but because their influence persisted. Their world bore the unmistakable fingerprints of something orchestrated. Laws emerged not as suggestions, but as obligations. Kingship was not claimed, it was granted. Cities did not expand randomly, they were placed. Their society had direction from the start. It moved with purpose, not instinct. Modern minds interpret this as mythologizing. Ancient minds experienced it as fact. Yet even as the Sumerians rebuilt their world on these inherited principles, a fracture widened beneath them. They remembered structure but not meaning. They knew how to enact rituals but not why those rituals mattered. They preserved names but lost context. They followed patterns but could not perceive the blueprint. Their civilization was a mosaic assembled from shards, beautiful, meticulous, incomplete. Imagine waking in a house you did not build, filled with tools whose functions you do not understand. You would learn to use them out of necessity, not comprehension. Over time, you would invent uses that approximate their original purpose. Eventually, your descendants would forget that the house was ever foreign. They would believe it was theirs. This was Sumer. They lived in the ruins of an age they never witnessed, and yet could not escape. The past was beneath their feet, around them in every wall, above them in every star, but always just out of reach. They could feel its shape, but not its essence, and so they built, wrote, taught, and prayed, hoping that meaning might reveal itself if memory were faithfully tended. In this effort, they were noble, but they were also doomed. Civilizations do not die when their enemies defeat them. They die when their memories become rituals without reference, when action persists but purpose dissolves, when form remains but soul vacates. The Sumerians lasted longer than we give them credit for, but eventually the erosion began. Languages changed, borders shifted, gods were renamed, then reinterpreted, then discarded. The rituals remained, but no longer as threads of continuity, now as echoes without listeners. By the time their clay tablets were buried beneath the dust, their civilization was not dead. It had forgotten itself. We like to believe we are different. We assume our age is irreversible, our knowledge permanent. But permanence is an illusion cast by the arrogance of the present. Our cities are sophisticated, yes, but so were theirs. Our technologies seem miraculous, but so did theirs. Our confidence mirrors theirs with unsettling symmetry. Like Sumer, we stand surrounded by mysteries we cannot explain. Like Sumer, We rely on systems few understand. Like Sumer, we believe ourselves unique, exceptional, chosen by history herself. And like Sumer, we rarely question why humanity is compelled to create structure from chaos, to carve meaning into stone, to record time, to align monuments with the heavens. These impulses are not inventions. They are instincts, echoes. Something inside us knows what came before, even if our minds do not. It manifests as yearning, curiosity, anxiety, awe. It pulls us toward the stars without telling us why. It teaches us patterns before we know numbers. It guides us towards stories before we speak language. Memory precedes identity. Perhaps this is the true inheritance of Sumer, not their myths, not their cities, not their language, but their realization that civilization is not a destination. It is an obligation, a task unfinished, a story we enter mid-sentence. Every generation thinks it writes the first chapter. Every generation is wrong. We are not the first to gaze at the heavens and wonder where we came from. We are the latest to do so. Our telescopes are not windows into the unknown. They are mirrors reflecting forgotten questions. Our databases do not store facts. They store anxieties. We build archives not because we know, but because we fear forgetting. Like Sumer, we are haunted by an absence. We sense that something vital lies behind us, just beyond the reach of language. We chase origins because origins chase us. In this pursuit we measure stars, decipher ruins, resurrect languages, and excavate cities. Yet each discovery does not simplify history. It complicates it. The more we learn, the clearer it becomes that someone knew something we do not, a someone who left clues scattered like breadcrumbs across millennia. The Sumerians tried to protect those crumbs. They failed. But their failure allows us to see something precious, the shape of loss. Loss is not the opposite of knowledge. Loss is the context of knowledge. Without loss, remembering would be meaningless. Without forgetting, learning would be unnecessary. Civilization requires both. The tragedy of Sumer is not that they fell. All civilizations fall. The tragedy is that they knew they would fall and still could not prevent it. Their memory was too heavy for the world they built. Their past was too vast for their present. What remains of Sumer is therefore not a warning nor a lament. It is an invitation to remember that history is not finished, that we are not at the end of a story but at the center of one, that what we believe is new may be old, and what we call ancient may be unborn. That humanity is not a line, but a breath, a cycle of remembering and forgetting, rising and falling, losing and finding. The question is not who we are, it is who we have been, and who someday we may remember becoming again. There is an invisible thread that connects all civilizations, a current that runs beneath the surface of human history like a subterranean river. We rarely acknowledge it, because we do not see it directly. Yet we feel it every time we wonder where we came from, every time we look at ancient ruins and experience a strange sense of familiarity, every time we dream of worlds we have never visited. This thread does not lead forward. It leads backward, towards something humanity once knew, then misplaced. The Sumerians lived closer to this thread than we do. They did not follow it out of curiosity but out of necessity. They believed that the stability of the world depended on remembering something essential, something older than themselves, older even than the flood they claimed had reshaped existence. Their culture was stitched together from fragments of memory. Every law, every symbol, every temple stone was an attempt to anchor reality to something that had nearly slipped away. To understand Sumer is to confront an unsettling idea. Memory is not a relic of the past. It is a force that shapes the present. The Sumerians did not remember because they were nostalgic. They remembered because they were afraid. They feared what forgetting would unleash. They feared that the world, if left without context, would unravel. Perhaps this is why their myths are obsessed with boundaries between chaos and order. In their stories, monsters do not lurk in caves. They lurk in forgotten histories. The unknown is not darkness, it is amnesia. Their gods are not creators, they are administrators of memory. They sustain existence not by making new things, but by preserving old truths. To modern ears this sounds strange. We imagine gods as beings of power, invention, and dominion. But to the Sumerians, the divine was not innovation, it was recollection. The gods were guardians of patterns, not inventors of them. They were custodians of knowledge so ancient that even they did not fully understand it. They passed fragments of this knowledge to humanity not out of generosity but out of desperation. Humanity was not created to rule, nor to worship, but to assist. The flood myth, central to Sumerian thought, is often interpreted as punishment, a cleansing of corruption. But to read it that way is to miss its true meaning. The flood did not cleanse the world. It erased orientation, it broke continuity, it collapsed the thread. After the waters receded, humanity did not emerge purified, it emerged confused. It had survived physically but not culturally. The world before the flood had grown vast. Its knowledge had expanded beyond containment. Its people had mastered forces that now seem mythological. Whatever happened, whether natural disaster, cosmic event, or human hubris, the flood severed humanity from itself. Sumer was the first attempt to reconnect that severed line. Imagine waking in a landscape where the bones of towers lie buried beneath sand, where broken mechanisms sparkle like fossils, where fragments of maps are etched into stone with no key to decipher them. You would not understand what you found, but you would know it meant something important, something dangerous to ignore. That is the world the Sumerians inherited. Their achievements were not the first flowering of civilization. They were the first buds after winter. They were the first green shoots pushing through soil that remembered the forest that came before. They didn't ask who planted the seeds. They asked how to keep them alive. Modern civilizations share this blind inheritance. We marvel at ancient engineering and imagine ourselves superior, forgetting that our technologies might one day look just as mysterious. We assume that progress moves forward, like a staircase. But what if it is more like a wheel? What if each age rediscovers tools it once wielded with ease? The Sumerians did not speculate about this. They stated it openly. They wrote that kingship was returned, not invented. They wrote that writing was given, not conceived. They wrote that humans were assigned tasks, not that they chose them. They wrote of eras when lifespans were measured not in decades but in centuries. They wrote of beings who shaped reality not with machines but with decree. They wrote of knowledge that preceded humanity. These claims unsettle us, not because they contradict logic, but because they contradict our pride. If the Sumerians are right, then we are not pioneers of civilization. We are beneficiaries of amnesia. We have recovered only a fraction of what was once known, and we misinterpret it as advancement. This realization casts a new light on the question of human purpose. If our achievements are echoes, if our inventions are recoveries, if our aspirations are inherited longings, then perhaps our trajectory is not self-directed. Perhaps we are being pulled towards something that lies in our past, not our future. What if humanity is not evolving, but remembering? What if our obsession with the stars is not curiosity, but recognition? What if the technologies we dream of, flight, energy without fuel, communication without distance, are not fantasies, but memories resurfacing? The Sumerians might say we're not inventing these dreams, we're remembering them. History is shaped, not by what is discovered, but by what is recalled. And yet, memory has a weight. The Sumerians understood this burden. They felt the pressure of living in a world whose foundation was not theirs. They sensed that they were caretakers of something too vast to comprehend. Their civilization thrived, but beneath its success lay exhaustion. Knowledge without context is a double-edged sword. It empowers, but it isolates. It inspires, but it overwhelms. Eventually Sumer fell, not through invasion, but through dilution. Memory frayed, tradition became habit, ritual became performance, meaning dissolved. Their threads snapped, but threads do not disappear. They entangle, they weave, they wait. The ruins of Sumer are not warnings. They are invitations. They remind us that civilization is not an invention. It is a responsibility. A torch passed from era to era, each flame flickering with memory carried across waters of forgetting. We hold that torch now, and whether we admit it or not, we feel its heat. It is why we search the ocean floors for lost continents. It is why we scan the sky for signals. It is why we write books, build archives, protect data, and fear oblivion. These are not modern impulses. They are ancient duties, resurfacing in new forms. The question is not whether we will face another flood. The question is whether we will be ready when it comes. The Sumerians tried to prepare the future. They failed. But in failing, they left us clues. Clues that whisper through cracked tablets and broken walls. Do not forget. Do not assume you are first. Do not lose the thread. For once the thread breaks, the world does not end. It begins again.